Rome. Sometime in the autumn of the year 9, the most powerful man on earth is beating his head against a doorpost. He has stopped shaving. He has stopped cutting his hair. And according to the historian Suetonius, he keeps repeating the same sentence. Quintili vare, legiones redde. Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions. They were somewhere here, roughly 1,000 kilometers northeast, in a forest he would never see. 3 legions, around 20,000 men, with their auxiliaries and their families. This is how Rome lost them in 3 days, and why the empire never crossed that river again. Not because Rome suddenly became weak, and not because Germania could never be invaded, but because the price of holding it had been revealed. By the year 9, Augustus had pushed Rome's border to the Rhine and the Danube. But the map had an inconvenient shape. Between the Rhine and the Elbe lay a bulge of hostile territory. It forced Rome to defend a long frontier, feed distant garrisons, and move men through country with few roads and almost no reliable supply system. Straighten the border to the Elbe, and Rome saves 2 entire armies worth of frontier. On an imperial map it looked like a rational correction. 1 shorter line, 1 navigable river, and a province that could eventually pay for its own occupation. The man sent to finish the job was Publius Quinctilius Varus. He was married into the imperial family. He was trusted. He was competent. Nothing in his career marked him as reckless or foolish. That matters, because Teutoburg was not caused by a cartoon villain making an obviously stupid choice, but his experience was Syria, a rich, taxed, administered province. His skill was extraction, not conquest. He had governed people who had already surrendered. In Germania, he behaved as if the fighting was over. He held courts, he collected tribute, and he had an interpreter, an advisor, and a friend, a Cheruscan nobleman called Arminius. Arminius had been sent to Rome as a hostage as a child. That was standard practice. He served in the Roman army. He was granted citizenship. He was given equestrian rank. Rome had spent 20 years teaching him exactly how a Roman army thinks. He understood its command structure, its marching discipline, its dependence on roads and baggage, and the precise moment when a column was most vulnerable, while moving, tired, and unable to deploy. The Germanic tribes did not unite easily. They raided each other more often than they raided Rome. Arminius did something no one had managed before. He got several of them to agree on a single plan. Cherussi, Marsi, Chatti, Bructeri. Not an army, a coalition with an expiry date. They did not need a shared government or a shared future. They needed only enough trust to keep the secret until Varus entered the killing ground. They knew they could not beat a legion in open ground, so they did not plan to fight one. The plan was geographic. Find terrain where a Roman formation cannot form. A legion's strength was collective, shields overlapping, officers visible, reserves moving where they were needed. Break that structure into isolated packets, and 5,000 trained soldiers become hundreds of separate fights. Then persuade the Roman commander to walk into it, voluntarily, at the end of the campaign season, September. The legions were preparing to leave summer camp for winter quarters on the Rhine. Then a report arrived. A minor rebellion among a distant tribe, small, local, easily crushed on the way home. A detour of a few days. The report came through Arminius. It was fabricated. Varus accepted it, and he did not strip his column down for a combat march. He took the baggage, he took the camp followers, he took the families. This was normal for a seasonal transfer, but disastrous for an emergency detour. Every cart widened the gaps, every animal slowed the pace, and every civilian made a sudden retreat more difficult. One Germanic noble tried to stop it. Segestes, Arminius's own father-in-law and his enemy. Tacitus records that he told Varus outright, "Arrest me, arrest Arminius, arrest all of us, then investigate." Varus dismissed it as a family feud. It was the last chance the 3 legions had. The warning sounded politically convenient, personal, and impossible to prove. Arminius had made certain that the truth looked exactly like jealousy. Legions 17, 18, and 19 marched off the road and into the trees. In open country, a legion of 5,000 men occupies about a kilometer of road. Here, with baggage and civilians, the column may have stretched 15 to 20 kilometers, which means the front and the rear were, in practice, 2 different armies. A shouted order could not travel that distance. A signal seen at the front meant nothing to men several hours of marching behind it. Arminius asked permission to ride ahead and raise local levies. Permission was granted. He took the Germanic auxiliaries with him. The column lost its eyes and most of its cavalry screen. Then the weather turned. Cassius Dio describes rain and wind that did not stop. Wagons sank, ropes snapped, the column compressed and stalled. Wet bowstrings failed, shields grew heavy, and men left the path simply to get around animals and carts. The route itself began dismantling Roman discipline. The first attack was not a charge. It was a volley from cover, into a stationary line. Men on baggage duty were not carrying their shields. Many were killed before they knew there was a battle. The Roman answer to ambush was to form up and advance. Here there was no room to form up. By the time orders reached the rear, the ambush at the front was already finished. The attackers did not press. They struck, withdrew, and let the forest do the next part. That restraint was crucial. A prolonged melee would have allowed Roman training to take over. Arminius kept turning a battle into a series of short, controlled disappearances. That evening, the Romans did what Romans always did. They built a camp. This is the detail that says everything. Discipline held. The army was not yet broken. Even under attack, Roman soldiers dug a ditch, raised a bank, posted guards, and created order before dark. Their system still worked whenever the ground allowed it. Varus made the correct decision far too late. Burn the baggage, abandon the wagons, move fast. Everything that had slowed them down was destroyed. The people who had come with it stayed. Day 2 began well. For a few hours the column moved as an army again. They reached open country. On open ground, the legions were still the best infantry in the world. And then the open ground ended. Archaeology at Kalkriese, in Lower Saxony, shows what they walked into. A wall of turf and timber, built in advance, along the slope above the path. Not an ambush of opportunity, a prepared fortification, on a route Rome had been steered towards. The wall protected the attackers while gaps in it allowed them to emerge, throw missiles, and vanish. The landscape had been converted into a weapon before Varus arrived. The gap was, in places, only a few hundred meters wide. Some of it was standing water. There was no way around it, and no way back. On one side stood the wooded slope and the wall. On the other lay wet, low ground. In between was a narrow corridor filled with soldiers, animals, broken carts, and people trying to move in opposite directions. The attack came from above and from the side, into a column that could not turn to face it. Varus was wounded. The senior officers began to die. Roman counterattacks went uphill, into fortification, in mud, under missiles. Roman armor weighed around 10 kilograms. In waterlogged ground, that stopped being protection. Some units held, some dissolved. Both outcomes ended the same way. By the end of the second day, this was no longer a battle. It was a process. Units were separated, surrounded, and reduced one at a time. Each collapse opened another gap, and every gap exposed the next group in the line. On the third day, the survivors were surrounded in open ground, in rain, without food. The cavalry commander, Numonius Valla, took the horsemen and rode for the Rhine. They were caught and killed. Tacitus describes it as desertion, and it changed nothing. The infantry had no such option. They stood in a circle that got smaller every hour. There was no intact road to follow, no commander who could coordinate a breakout, and no relief force close enough even to know where they were. Some fought to the end. The archaeology of Kalkriese shows Roman weapons used, not just abandoned. Varus killed himself. Several of his officers did the same. It was the correct decision by Roman standards, and it left the army with no command at all. His body was partly burned by his own men, then dug up. His head was sent to another Germanic king and forwarded to Rome. The men who surrendered were not ransomed. Tacitus records altars where officers were sacrificed, and skulls nailed to trees. 3 legionary eagles were taken. In Roman terms, that was the true casualty figure. Men could be recruited again. An eagle embodied the honor and legal identity of a legion. Losing it meant that the unit itself had ceased to exist. Something between 15 and 20,000 people died in roughly 3 days. The news reached the Rhine within days. Every fort east of the river was evacuated or lost. In Rome, Augustus dismissed his German bodyguard and expelled Gauls from the city. He was afraid of an attack that never came. Legions 17, 18, and 19 were never reformed. Rome had those numbers and never used them again. The empire also could not simply replace the men. Augustus had to conscript freed slaves and veterans. The plan to move the border to the Elbe was abandoned. The Rhine became the frontier for the next 400 years. Forts, roads, markets, and cities would grow along its western bank. On the far side, Rome would punish, trade, negotiate, and recruit, but not permanently absorb the region. Rome did come back. From 14 to 16 AD, Germanicus campaigned across the region with brutal efficiency. His men reached the battlefield. Tacitus describes them burying bones without knowing whose they were. Germanicus won engagements. He recovered 2 of the 3 eagles. He never destroyed Arminius. His campaigns proved that Roman armies could still cross the Rhine and defeat Germanic forces. They also proved how much money, shipping, manpower, and risk permanent conquest would require. The 3rd eagle came back only in the reign of Claudius, more than 30 years later. Arminius was killed around 21 AD by his own relatives, who suspected him of wanting to be king, and Tiberius stopped. The advice attributed to Augustus was to keep the empire within its existing borders. Teutoburg did not destroy Rome. It decided where Rome would stop. The site was lost for 18 centuries. In 1987, a British army officer with a metal detector found Roman coins in a field near Osnabrück. The landscape looked ordinary because farmland had softened the battlefield, but the objects beneath it formed a trail along the same narrow corridor described by the ancient sources. Then came the sling bullets, the bones, the fragments of the turf wall, and a mule bell stuffed with grass to keep it silent. A tiny act of field discipline, preserved by accident. Someone had silenced the animal before the march and never returned to remove the packing. And a cavalry face mask, stripped of its silver, lying where it fell. Much later, nationalists made Arminius a symbol. He was not fighting for a nation. Nations did not exist yet. The tribes that followed him had separate leaders, separate interests, and old rivalries. Their unity lasted long enough to destroy Varus, then began to fracture. What actually happened here was narrower and stranger. A Roman officer used Roman training to delete a Roman army. Next, the Fire Brigade of Rome, 7,000 men, no hoses, and a businessman who bought your house while it burned.